Um, I wanted to talk about the sort of the question of purpose, and really as to do this as a bit of a provocation. Um, this this is a kind of, for me, a perennial, and I've seen. I mean, recently been thinking about it some more since I wrote the Grammar of Systems, and there've been a number of quite heated and entrenched debates I've seen on social media about this. It was thrown into sharp relief for me when I was doing co-delivering a training session on ethics in systems practice earlier on this year, and that kind of gave a different dimension, or it reflected into a different dimension for me. So I don't sort of have real answers on this, but I thought it was of abiding interest. So I thought playing around with the ideas might be worth doing, and hopefully that'll provoke some responses from people, and we can have an ongoing conversation beyond this meeting. So I want to look a little bit about how it relates to different methodologies and the tribalism that historically plagued the field. I mean, thank God it's largely gone away now. And the mutual incomprehension between different tribes within the systems thinking community. And the more I think about this, the more I think that this is the split, or a split in the systems thinking field, is around this, the different conceptions of purpose. I want to talk a little bit about how that actually manifests, and what the evidence is for both sides of the argument, and how it relates to other areas, so ethics in systems and systems leadership, which people talk a lot about, with varying degrees of sort of depth, really, and then towards a reconciliation. So how I think of this as a kind of joined up thing, or to use Jan's thing, coherent. So the two perspectives I'm kind of looking at, I'm characterizing as purposeful and purposive. I'm using sort of traditional definitions of this rather than the Checklin definition, which is slightly different. So purposeful, which is purpose as intention. So my purpose for this talk is, and that's about my intention for the talk. Versus on the purposive side, a more of a POSIWID view. So purpose of a system is what it does. So the view that systems, organizational systems or social systems, have their own momentum, they have their own direction, they have their own dynamics, they have their own being. And that is not dependent on the intention of whoever it was who may have designed them or thought they designed them, or even of the people populating those. So those two views are quite different in that way, the POSIWID view and the purposeful view. And they anchor in quite different places. So the purpose's intention obviously is anchored in the intent or the motivation, the will of specific actors, particularly individuals, can be organizations, but particularly individuals. And the anchoring is an important word here, because the implication of this is that it fixes your attention on that aspect of purpose, rather than making it easy to sort of move between the two perspectives, really. For purposive, for the POSIWID view, the anchoring is in the system's emergent properties. This system has these emergent properties, which are, it is what it is because it does what it does. It has its own structures, it has its own dynamics, it has its own relationships, and it produces this purpose. It heads in this direction because of it is what it is, independently of the intention. So the anchoring works on both sides. In the purposive, it anchors your attention onto the system and what it's doing and being. In the purposeful side, it anchors you on the intent of the individuals, and those are two very, very different places. Where that anchoring takes you is into an assumption, or it's based in a sense in assumption, on the purposeful side, that the individual's agency is around their ability to define, design, direct, and shape the system. On the purposive side, it's the system's agency to shape the individuals that are within it, or that are involved with it. So we're looking at agency from two completely different directions, if you like. In one sense, you can, and I mean, this is arguable, and I'm sure people will argue about it. In one sense, the purposeful I see as being an external in, and therefore an objective view. It is viewing the system in an objective way, and looking from the outside into it or at it, as a thing, as a system to be changed, to exercise our intent on through our agency. Whereas the purposive side, the POSIWID side, is much more subjective, in that you're looking almost from within at what it does, and what is, and your view is subject to the dynamics and structures and relationships of that system, the action of that, the agency of that system. So very, very different places, very, very different views. And it kind of splits the field. So you know, we have methodologies that are based essentially on the purposeful view. So the Checklin soft systems, or Wilson soft systems, is a purposeful. You know, it says, you know, essentially we want a system to do X by means of Y for purpose Z. Similarly, with CSH. And there are others like Akov's interactive planning, you know, that follow this line, that it is about the intent and agency of individual actors or groups of actors. Purposive, we have a different set of approaches. So BSM is essentially, well, where POSIWID comes from, is essentially looking at it in the purposive way, as is system dynamics. So in system dynamics, you are building a dynamic model of the system and saying, hey, it does this. And then saying, well, do we like that or do we not like that? But you start with that understanding of the inherent characteristics and of the system, and what it's actually doing itself. Similarly, with our patterns of strategy, you're looking at what naturally happens if this system does its thing. And again, there are other approaches, interactive management. The Christakis stuff follows this purposive perspective. Mosaic transformation, or bubble strategy, as a change management approach, both systemic change management approaches kind of sit between. They start very, very briefly on the purposeful side, and then switch immediately into the purposive to understand the dynamics and relationships in the system. So there's a little bit of in between there, and to some extent, you know, all of these approaches can walk you between the two. They're just, their start points are different. And I think, going back to, with reference to Simon's talk which was focused very heavily on mindset, I think the interesting thing in this is the mindset that the start point engenders, hence the reference to anchoring. I think the The anchoring thing is about whether it fixes your mindset, even if the practice moves from, for example, purposeful to purposive. To me, this has been one of the major features of the kind of tribalism and brick throwing that a decade or more ago we were subject to in the field. I remember, you know, as somebody who was known as a viable system modeler, going to conferences with groups that were dominated by soft systems modelers, and it being a pretty vile experience, actually. I mean, people practically almost spitting on it. I mean, you know, you were under no illusion that you were loathed and hated and despised. And that was the degree of tribalism in the field. Thank God that's now passed. But I think part of this, not necessarily the emotional part, but certainly the part of the intellectual part is based on this this split in the understanding of the nature of purpose. So from the purposeful side, you've got this allegation that that everybody else assumes the system. So this kind of naive, oh well, they just assume it's like a car and the boundaries are fixed, and you know, all that sort of stuff. The allegation that was thrown really, really often that people from coming at it from purposive side ignored multiple perspectives. Looking the other way, the allegation is that the purposeful people tend to ignore emergent behavior, emergent properties of the system, so they don't look at it. And I mean, I've had conversations with SSMers and CSHers where you mention emergence and they kind of look at you blankly, like that's got nothing to do with systems. And more pragmatically, from the purposive view, the allegation, I guess, is that purposeful people kind of look at a system and go, well, we want it to do this, and the reality of, you know, real world systems just don't behave that way. They don't just conform to what you intend. And equally, I mean, interestingly, both sides tend to throw that's an engineering approach at the other side. So looked at from the purposive side at the people who are doing intent, that looks like an engineering approach, because you're taking a real world situation and saying, I want to engineer that to do what I want. That's what engineering does. And on the purposeful side, they look at the people doing sort of VSM and SD and stuff like that and go, well, that's an engineering approach, because what you're doing is looking at the internal workings, which is how you understand part of how you understand how emergent properties are developed. So both sides chuck that allegation of the other being an engineering approach. Why that's considered an insult, I don't know, speaking as a ex-engineer, but there you go. And equally, both throw the allegation of naivety at the other. So from the purposeful side, the purposive people are naive because they shortchange the role of people in it, and from the purposive side, they're naive because they shortchange the role, the power of the system in it. And at the worst, they just say, well, a system is anything I think it is. It's not real. So, which it can be seen as solipsistic. Just reality doesn't exist. It is just my mind. So those allegations have been thrown back and forth across this intellectual divide. And as I say, that doesn't account for the emotional charge that used to go with it. Again, thank God, less than it was. But I think this is the intellectual bit, the emotions largely died away, but the intellectual divide still exists. and I think is, you know, part of my reason for walking around it in a sense. Evidentially, so if you look at it kind of empirically, what's to be said for the purposeful side? Well, problem definition, system diagnosis, system design, system development, all of that is only possible relative to what you intend. There is no meaning to any of those without understanding intent, stakeholders' intent. So you can't, you know, intent clearly does matter. You can't really act without taking intent into account. It's fundamental to practice, really. And on the purposive side, I mean, several people, I think Jan talked about this in the first talk. You know, the vast majority of strategies and transformations, as did Simon actually, the vast majority of strategies and transformations don't follow intent. They go with the emergent properties of the system. So, you know, if you take the sort of Kaplan and Norton view that or position that 90% of strategies fail, it's a slightly apocryphal figure, but it's you know, it's as good as anybody else's. And I've never heard anybody actually contest it and say, oh no, it's much less than that, really. That means that only 10% is actually consistent with, you know, is intent driving through. The rest is 90% is no, the power of the system is what won. Transformation between 70 and 90%, the power of the system is what wins. It's not the intent of the individual that wins that game. And you see this sort of morphing, and this is part of the anchoring thing, really, that where you get repeated systemic patterns, like repeated systemic patterns of strategy failure. It gets, or repeated systemic patterns of any system behavior. It gets transposed and interpreted as individual behaviors. Which is the kind of anchoring in the, oh, well, it must just be about intent when it isn't. But the systemic patterns override the individual most of the time, and that's how the 70% happens. The more I go on, the more I think this is, you know, this split in the field is kind of one of the defining characteristics of the architecture of our discipline, because we have methodologies that sit on one side and we have methodologies that primarily sit on the other. And there isn't that much that kind of sits comfortably in between. And the join between the two is not always a desperately comfortable one. It's not a desperately comfortable one methodologically, it's not a desperately comfortable one intellectually, and it's not a desperately comfortable one as a practitioner. But it's one that we all have to navigate somehow if we're going to do systems practice. This spills into loads of other fields. So I mentioned the ethics stuff. I'm indebted to John Rogers, who was sort of co-delivering the training on ethics with me, for the fantastic words deontological and consequentialist, both of which were new to me. But this is because he's got proper training in ethics, and I've just got practical training in an approach to doing it in systems. So the deontological ethical position is that what should underpin your ethical stance is motivation rather than effect. So that is very, very clearly your intent is what matters ethically more than the emergent properties of what happens, versus a consequentialist or utilitarian view that the effects are more important than the intent.
So the ethical field is split on exactly the same lines, and this is well documented. You go and read stuff on ethics. This is absolutely there. Those two positions are the major positions in ethics, and for exactly the same reason as they are major positions in systems practice. I think it goes to one of the core things that we have to deal with as practitioners. Pretty much all the time in systems practice, we're looking at the relationship between the agency of individuals versus the agency of the system that those individuals are in, or that those individuals are trying to intervene in. And that hits us all the time as practitioners, because quite often we are almost inevitably smaller and have less variety than the systems we're trying to affect, and we're always trying to affect a system because that's what systems practice is. So that agency of individual versus agency of the system is kind of the world we're playing in. So understanding it in these terms, I think, is quite important. A lot going on in the, well, I don't know if there's a lot going on. A lot of people are talking about systems leadership these days, and I'm sure some of the people on this call will be practicing in that field. Leadership theory. I mean, if you read the outside of systems leadership books, if you read systems literature, there is very little reference to leadership, and if you read leadership books, there's very little reference to systems. So leadership theory, so there isn't a natural overlap in this world. Systems leadership aims to do that, but it's generally starting from a leadership theory position rather than a systems position. So leadership theory focuses on the agency of the individual rather than the system being led. I've tried working with some systems leadership people and trying to get them to look at the actual business of leading or being led rather than the internal characteristics of leaders is vanishingly, just appallingly difficult. The focus is entirely on internal characteristics of leaders. And you can actually see that in the language. So we talk about leadership as if leadership was a thing rather than leading or, as I say, being led. So the focus there is on the purposeful. Or could systems leadership be an approach that asks, what would it mean to lead given the agency of this system? So given what the system allows us to do, or is trying to, the direction it's going in itself, what would leadership look like in that context? And I think, referencing back to a previous talk, is it just about finding a parade and standing in front of it, which is a fairly common leadership model, and then pretending it was your parade all along. So I think the untangling of the purposeful, purposive thing is fundamental, or should be fundamental, in systems leadership. Sadly, I think it isn't. So I know the ethics people wrestle with this all the time, and of course that's as tribal as the systems field used to be over this. Systems leadership, I'm happy to be corrected on this, but I haven't seen much in that field that actually has got to grips with this at all. I think there's for anyone who fancies it, there's a game to be played there. There's a name to be made for yourself. Same thing plays out in other areas. So performance management. There is a massive split in the performance management field between
practice that involves setting goals and then performance targets and the metrics for that, which is the purposeful approach to performance management, versus what came in from Deming and Toyota and Lean and all that sort of stuff, which is a purposive approach, which is basically you measure the performance of the system that you're trying, or the process you're trying to work with, and then decide what you want to do about it. And those two really don't understand one another either. Those two paradigms in the performance management field absolutely split the field. I've got a relationship with the Center for Business Performance, which is one of the at Cranfield, which is one of the leading performance management things in the world. I mean, they run the Performance Management Association conference, international conference. I've tried having this conversation in that community, and it kind of doesn't go anywhere. They absolutely will not grapple with the fact that there are two paradigms at work, and they are incompatible and totally incommensurate. They just pretend the difference isn't there. It's just an approach, in operations management, I mean, the war's over. The purposive won. So that kind of was the victory of the Toyota approach over the goal-centric Ford and traditional approach epitomized by Ford and General Motors. And that was one when kind of Toyota became number one, top dog, before a lot of other stuff happened, and now we're in Tesla territory. And this is kind of encapsulated in the performance management field in Goodhart's law, which says, basically you can't, as soon as a performance measure becomes a target, it stops being a useful performance level measure, because the two are simply not consistent. You cannot do both. Strategy eats culture for breakfast. Apparently Drucker never said this, but it still does the rounds. And it in a sense, it's still true. I mean, I would argue that culture is an emergent property of the system, and therefore what we're actually talking about when people say culture eats strategy, not strategy eats culture, should be the other way around. Sorry, culture eats strategy. What's actually happening when culture eats strategy is the system is beating the intent. But that's widely recognized, and yet people still fall back on the intent. They don't say, right, let's try and understand how that works. They go, yeah, let's just push the intent thing more. Organizational behavior and organizational development. So cornerstone of this is Kurt Lewin, and his Lewin's formula. So behavior is a function of the person, including their characteristics, and their intent, and the environment, the systems that they are in. So occupational psychologists and organizational behavior and organizational development practitioners and leadership coaches and yada, 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 they focus on half of this equation. They focus on the individual, and they focus on their intent. They don't focus on the system the environment in which this is happening. And as a result, resistance to change, which was a big thing for Lewin, which was systemic in Lewin's view. It was, Lewin's view was this: what we're interested in is the agency of the individual relative to the agency of the system they're in. And when you're trying to impose your intent on the system, what the system naturally resists that, because it has to, it's the nature of a system, otherwise it would fall to pieces. That, when you put it through that anchoring too hard in the intent side, then gets refactored as personal resistance. So that again, the power of the system in this, the momentum of the system, the dynamic of the system to carry on doing what the system is doing, simply gets ignored. So this, you get this incredibly one-sided view. So how do we reconcile this as practitioners? So I want to get rid of one of the sort of things that gets thrown around that simply isn't true. Everybody agree in systems practice, everybody agrees, and they always have, that system definitions and boundaries are chosen and described by observers. So the whole allegation of, if you do purposive, you're assuming what the definition of the system is and the boundaries. No, that's not how it works, and it's not how it's ever worked. That's an allegation thrown from an entirely purposeful perspective about a purposive perspective that is simply wrong. It doesn't work like that. Intervention in the system is purposeful. I mean, it can be non-purposeful, but in terms of effective intervention, what we are trying to do as practitioners is implement some intent. So that's not just legitimate, it's essential. The intent, I mean, this is a difficult one. I find that the intent is not independent of the system, it's conditioned by it. So even what we intend is constrained at the very least by the system. In politics, this is known as the Overton window. Politicians dream what they dream and think what they think and plan what they plan relative to what they can get away with, what the system will allow them to do. And as soon as they step outside that, then they stop being able to be effective at all. And in a similar way, it's the same for systems practitioners. We can only practice we need intent to practice. Otherwise, we're not going to, that's what decides what we're going to try and change in the system. But it has to be done within this is what the system is trying to do. It is doing itself and what it will allow us to do. So we need both of those, both the purposeful and the purposive stance as practitioners to be effective. And part of that then is where do you choose to stand, or inside the system looking out, or outside the system looking in, and how do you move between those two? If we need to be able to do both, how do we move between those two? So in soft systems, you define your intent before you understand what the system's going to allow you to do. You start by saying, we define this as, we want a system to do X by means of Y for purpose Z. In an ideal world, it would look like this. Then you go, and what does it look like? So what is it going to allow us to get away with? So you're moving from the outside of the system to inside the system, and then kind of back again. In VSM, system dynamics, patterns of strategy, really what you're trying to do is understand the internal dynamic and the structure of the system before you decide what to do about it. So that's looking the other way. So moving from the inside to the outside and back again. So both of them should involve a change of stance, either from inside to outside or outside to inside. The difficulty, part of the difficulty, I think, is the anchoring problem, that if you believe it's just about intent, it becomes difficult, really difficult to truly understand the dynamics of the thing. And if you believe that it's just about the dynamics of the thing, the POSIWID thing, it can create a kind of helplessness of how can I how can I hope to change this beast? And you see that, and I see both problems in system practitioners, and see it in myself, you know. So you see system practitioners who are too wrapped up in the system is doing this. I have no hope of changing that. And you have people who are, well, it should be doing this, and without actually going into understanding what it's doing and why it's doing it and why and how it is going to resist your intent. To be effective, we need to be able to do both, and we need to be able to slide fairly seamlessly between. And I guess where I'm going really is this. So why is this so damned hard? If we need the ability to adopt both stances and to move between them, why is it some people seem so entrenched in arguing just one of them? I see behavioral parallels with, you know, you get loads of arguments in the systems field where you get reductionists who reject holism, and they can't even see the point of it, you know. And I wonder if it's that same sort of dogmatism, and I don't know. I'd be interested in other people's views. Or is this actually just a real high wire act? So the Scott Fitzgerald quote: "The test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposing ideas in mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function." And essentially what we're asking is that, can you hold the intent and the purposeful and the purposive at the same time? Slide relatively effortlessly between them to come to a, given what it is that, you know, we should be doing this, and this is how it will work to change what it is, which is, you know, getting that effective balance between the agency of the individual and the agency of the system. So those were my thoughts on this, and I'd be interested in any thoughts, discussions, questions, answers, anything that anybody else has got, really.
I may have a I may have an answer to your questions. Why are we so entrenched? So it was very interesting what you told. I was constantly thinking about the first model that I showed, the four quadrants, the colors. And I think that it's the one truth versus the multiple truths. So the purposive is the one truth, and what I thought, why it's not only that we are on separate sides of the divide to start with, but both sides try to tell the other side what to do. So our conclusions are on the other side, and that makes it even more difficult to come together, I think. And I totally agree with you that model of Jan Lely helps me to see that. Yeah, you have to move from left to right and from right to left and back again. So yeah, very interesting. So thanks.
I don't know if this is just a practice thing or what, but yeah, interested in other people's comments. Because I've been presenting, I haven't been looking at the chat. So if you've got questions, shout them, because, you know, there's a lot of stuff to look through.
I was doing this last week, this sort of thing last week. I'm working in a voluntary organisation. It's a community association, and we were kind of taking a sort of step back at what we should be doing, and how we relate to the local council. And I did two things. Firstly, I asked them to come up with a statement of identity. What do we exist for? And that was interesting, because they came up with different levels. Some people said we exist to do X. Sorry, we exist to do Y by doing X, and some just said we exist to do Y, which didn't really differentiate the organisation very well. And then I did the sort of structural coupling thing, where I got a context diagram and said, what, you know, who are we interfacing with, and what's our relationship? That latter conversation was a lot more productive, I think. but so in a sense, that's a bit more purposive than purposeful, I think, the intent.
Yeah.
Although the intent also throwed up interesting differences. So I think they both work, and I'd sort of start with the intent and then go to the other bit, because that seemed to work quite well.
I mean, I think it's pragmatically, it's context specific where you start and where you don't, I guess. But,
Yeah, yeah, I think you're right. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Conscious of time, so we've only got a couple more minutes. So somebody pile in. Aidan.
There's something here about there's something here, because I went from the start of this, which is really interesting. Just going, I just don't see this as a problem, if you know what I mean. And I'm not going to make a play for having a higher level of intelligence. But what I'm going to say is that some people want words to only mean one thing, and they never do, if you know what I mean. And I thought that for a long time. So I wonder if the people who can't see both are just a little bit totalitarian about their language, if you know what I mean. If that makes sense.
I also used to think that the thing that changed my view on it, Aidan, was that methodologically it's different. So you walk different paths. So it isn't just it's a different name on the signpost. You actually go a different journey.
Oh, I get that.
And the different journey takes you to a different endpoint.
Yeah, no, I get that. I think I was wondering if people were not acknowledging that. Let me think about this. Best way to express this. It's almost like a nominative determinism. That because they couldn't account for it being two meanings, they thought they had to choose one, if you know what I mean. Yeah.
I absolutely get your point. I think it's slightly more than that, because I mean, I agree with you. At one level, I go, this isn't that bloody hard, you know. At another level, it kind of is, because you are actually stepping between methodological stances, you know.
Yes,
and I think this is part of the not being too anal about following method, you know.
Yeah. I think you're right too. Yeah.
But I don't know. I honestly don't know. I mean, you know, it's interesting that the ethics guys have absolutely fundamentally not managed to resolve this, and the performance management guys have absolutely fundamentally not managed to resolve this.
Yeah. Probably because it's
solution.
Say again, Anna.
Yeah.
Maybe there's not a solution, and maybe it's not a problem to be solved, but maybe you're more exposed to it, Patrick, because of your association with VSM, and, you know, like you were talking about, like, soft systems, but I think even in the literature, you would rarely follow that from start to finish as is. You might take some ideas and from it and apply it, and, you know, and then maybe even develop your own version of a combination of methodologies that are adapted to a particular situation. Like, I don't think I would ever follow something through from start to finish, partly because I don't think I could do it justice, but
I've seen some of your work, and you can. I think partly that's right, Emma. And I was doing is this purely a sequence thing? So because SSM as written goes from one to another, and VSM, you know, depending on what you're using it for, there are various tracks, but they both, you know, they all involve both. Is this actually just a which you do first thing? And I think it should be, if you're doing it well. I think it's just that some people just get stuck, but I don't know why they get stuck. Sorry, Ed.
Well, I was just going to say that, well, it's a dualism, isn't it? Again, which, you know, it's an either or, when by and large everything in the world is both.
Yeah.
Dualism is very attractive. You see this particularly in politics. You know, people rates either we must do this or we must do this, and this is actually impossible to do, therefore we must do this. I mean, it's just a trick of language. and you see it, you know, the interviews, the adversarial interviews. I mean, that's what they live off, is posing dualisms. Then people can have a good argument and they think they've done a useful job. The thing, I mean, in relation to climate change and actually doing something real about it, it's replete with targets. And all that you were saying about targets is just, you know, so true. That the attraction of them often is to try, in a world that it's so difficult to do stuff, is to try and say that we're doing something. So the next COP will set targets, which will then be missed, but they feel, you know, trooping back onto their planes, that actually they're doing something. And I mean, I think it's absolutely, you know, that purposeful, purposive. I think it's a brilliant way of understanding why government fails so much. And I mean, the only other thing I'd say is, obviously, if you know an awful lot about one particular method, in this case politics, but it might be VSM or something else, then you're going to, you know, you're going to push your method because that's what you know about. But I thought it was absolutely excellent, Patrick. And yeah, if you can basically school up every politician in the world on that, then we might have a chance of doing something about climate change.
I wasn't loading it that much, Ed, but you know, thank you. I think your point about I think that what you've said is part of my point about the tribalism thing. I think partly this dualism has been created in order to create tribes, in order to build reputations, in order to, you know, but even when that's sort of those boundaries have been broken down, and we all love one another and do hugs, there's still something there, you know. And maybe that's just residual.